Hi, my name is Dr. Rona Halualani from Halualani Associates, and I wanted to share with you some key highlights from the diversity mapping project that my team and I have completed for you. We have reached the final phase of our mapping project, meaning that all maps and analyses have been completed, and it's December 2014, which was the slated end goal of this project. I want to remind you that the mapping for us is a methodology that we created about 8 years ago. We've mapped 32 campuses, and it's a methodology which assesses all of the efforts you've actually done. Not what you say you're going to do or you promised you were going to do, but what's actually been done in a certain period of time. And it keeps it as the baseline, your kind of before picture, before you're about to engage in a strategic action sequence, which is one of our recommendations that you do so. We use 25 analytical layers, and we really highlight what you have going for you now, things that you're already doing well that you can kind of elevate and do more of or scale it or whatnot. And the gaps are the opportunities about things that have not yet been approached or done. Our methodology is really about, it involved a couple of steps. We scraped your website in terms of all the key information about diversity and inclusion through search engine optimization. We collected information from your campus divisions. Thank you so much, CSU San Marcos. Over 500 documents were submitted to the Dropbox email address that you submitted. And keep in mind, these documents were not just one page. They were accreditation reports, which were 250 pages each. They were things that you're doing for faculty recruitment and retention, which was a 20-page report, or student affairs submitted some really terrific event descriptions along with the training agendas and even assessment measures and whatnot. So it was a really, really lovely effort on your part, and we appreciate it. We take all that info, we put it on a spreadsheet, we analyze that spreadsheet according to 25 analytical layers, because it's not how many things you've done, it's really the quality and the aspects of it that we're able to analyze. We analyze it both quantitatively and qualitatively. That's kind of our background. I'm a social scientist, but I'm trained predominantly also in discourse analysis and qualitative aspects. So we use SPSS and our own traditional hand coding, as well as NVivo and QDA minor, and we use it to identify gaps, leverage points, and whatnot for your analysis. There are two components that we look at: diversity efforts, which is basically anything that's not a course. It could be an event. It could be a scholarship program for students from first-generation college-going families. It could be a community partnership. It could be a center or an institute that you have on your campus. Courses are your undergraduate and your graduate courses in your most recent catalog. And remember, with courses, we don't just look at your descriptions. We looked at outcomes. We read over 600 syllabi. We looked at assignments. Faculty members gave us their rubrics. They shared kind of their understanding of how students are performing. Some of them let us see snippets of things that were being performed without violating anything. And our time frame was in the last 4 years. January 1st, 2010 till November 1st. We went forward as far as November 1st, 2014. So it was a 4-year window. Now, I know that some of you wanted us to go farther, but we really focus on the recency. But on certain issues, we actually did some detective work, and we looked as far back as 10 years ago, and we read documents from 10 years ago or so to give us context. So please know that that was not lost on us. The maps themselves, though, are focused on the last 4 most recent years. We did 3 campus visits. I actually think I've been out there more, which was nice to get to know you all and to make sure that you all understand about this process. We conducted close to 28, if not more, individual focus group sessions with students, staff, faculty members, administrators. Sometimes those were one-on-one. Sometimes they were in a dyad, or sometimes they were with 8 or 10 folks. Remember, those focus group sessions, what came out of that was really to give us contextual information that we need to know to elucidate what we were finding in our maps. You will not see those comments or notions in the maps, but they definitely inform our analysis and the maps. So please know that those are very much in here, but they are figured in a little bit differently. There was an open anonymous comment survey of 196 responses. We didn't ask any demographic. We are the only ones to see that raw data. We cannot track those responses. In addition, we did a diversity pedagogy instrument, which was a DPI. We reviewed many syllabi. I said over 600, as well as over 300 assignments. But we also wanted to ask faculty, lecturers, part-timers, tenure track, what do you do with diversity in your classroom? Because I don't think we ask faculty members that enough and to find out. We asked what are the 3 courses they teach the most and then broke it down from there. 125 of your faculty members responded. Conservatively, I think it's about a 20% response rate given the total number of tenure track and lecturers on your campus. I would have liked to have it a little bit higher, but it's respectable from a social scientist point of view, 18 to 20% roughly. And we reviewed 525 documents via Dropbox. In addition, it should be noted that we received a really terrific enrollment spreadsheet from one of your campus members who, and I will thank her in person when I'm out there, who gave us your last 6 semesters in terms of what you've offered. Why we like that is even though we code all of the diversity-related courses in your curricula, undergraduate and graduate, there's a difference between what's created and how much of it's offered. So we actually have that full analysis. We've completed 7 maps to you, which I will bring to you in February. Your mapping committee has already seen these maps as well as heard our analysis, not the fullest, but like a 2.5-hour presentation conducted by me. We had 3 related to your efforts, unit, theme, and the effort of those functions, as well as 4 on your curricula, undergraduate, graduate, and we even do the same information about the courses, but by how the courses are approaching diversity in a primary way. Was it on race and ethnicity? Was it on gender? Was it on intersectionalities? What is that on international global? And for us, I think what's important here too is that the qualitative feedback did inform and give us that larger portrait of what we found. So these were the most resonating themes. The key one is that diversity is a divisive issue on your campus. We saw a lot of comments in the focus group sessions as well as in your open anonymous comment survey opportunity that there are identity politics and even a sense of hostility about how diversity is talked about on your campus, who gets to say what, and how often. The words bullies were used quite a bit, that the interactions are toxic, that it's very difficult to have conversations. There's a politics of speaking around diversity. These encounters are hostile. Leadership does not and often rewards bad behavior. And it was the full gamut of it. When I come out there in February, I'm going to want to talk to you about that, in particular about how do you move forward, because these interpersonal and historical dynamics around who gets to say what, what's allowable, what's not approached and interrogated, will impede you on making meaningful strategic sequencing in terms of the future. So this really important issue, especially amongst faculty and staff, that students can notice as well, because they were talking about it, is going to be a huge issue from you moving forward. So that was not lost on us. That helped to inform what we were seeing and what we were thinking of. There was also the notion that you all look at inclusion, but at the expense of real movement on issues of diversity. So there was a sense of we do a lot of getting people to the table, and that's really, really important. But we stop there, and we spend so much time there that we don't look at how inclusion's also connected to inequalities, and that some voices are muted over others. And what does that mean? CSUSM is also seen as looking at diversity, but not necessarily in terms of social justice, that the campus is too careful on issues of diversity and doesn't want to offend people. There is this tension between safe spaces and, oh my goodness, if we're creating a space for them, we're including those people. And I do think there has to be maybe a more nuanced way of looking at safe spaces and the amount of work that they do for a specific community that needs that safe space. And that's different from being exclusionary. And the idea that there was an idea that many of those safe spaces were being dominated by allies. So although well-intentioned, there's a cultural political issue there that needs to be addressed. Committed to diversity, but not on core issues of race. Students felt that there was more diversity action that needed to be done by administrators rather than gestures, that they saw microaggressions happening in the classrooms. There needs to be more diversity exposure for commuter students. The identity-based centers were vulnerable. And the last two that we really saw across the board was the lack of respect or inclusion, often for lecturers. So they feel that they're not included in many of the diversity efforts. And that this was a common theme that we saw, is that the female faculty felt they were overworked on committees and in service. You do have one of the highest percentages of female faculty in the CSUs in Southern California, which I did for another report for you. So there is that as well. So in terms of the work of diversity, is CSU San Marcos making diversity happen? The answer to this question is yes, in part. And remember, I only have time to do highlights in the Slidecast. You have 557 diversity efforts that have been engaged in the last 4 years. And the good news about that, and remember, it's not the number, because everyone's like, what's a good number? What's a good number? It's the quality. So you could have 10, well, maybe not just 10. You could have 20 to 40 diversity efforts. But it would be the interest of who do they reach? What are they about? What's the level of engagement? What's the quality of those efforts is really more of our concern. Of those 557 efforts, the vast majority are primarily focused on diversity. I mean, they're centrally designed to serve that purpose. We often go to campuses where it's the opposite of what you see here on this slide. 88% or 80% of their efforts are partial, which means that diversity is more of an additive component. It's like business as usual, student recruitment, because, we're tuition driven. But then there's a component over here that's added later about diversity. And that's important, but it's a different feel than primary diversity efforts. All divisions are on deck, meaning that you have every division participating in some way on diversity. Now, the leaders here are the top three you see. Student affairs, and remember, keep this in mind, student affairs drives the diversity actions on almost every campus we go to. It could be a high private university, it could be Ivy League, it could be public, but student affairs, this is what they do, and they are the lead at your campus. However, 24% are by your academic affairs, and ODEEI&O, which is the Office of Diversity, Educational Equity, and Inclusion, Inclusive Excellence, and Ombudsman Services are also becoming kind of the central connectivity portion and doing a great share. So 24% is more than what we see for academic affairs normally. And what I do want to point out to you is that 179 of your efforts are actually collaborations. So 32% of your efforts means that at least 2 units are working together. Now, that is terrific. We don't ever see that, actually. We see the highest we've seen is maybe 40%. So you are working together, and is it because you're focused on that goal? Yes. Is it also because you're cost sharing, which means that there's kind of a resource allocation issue where you want to do something really important, but you can't afford it on your own? That, to me, is something to think about with regard to the strategy for the future. If diversity and inclusion is important, are we resourcing it on an effort standpoint so that units can do things, they can do things together, but they also can do things on a larger scale with one another that's resourced better. So we'll have more conversations about that with you in February. We have this sequence where we talk about change order, which it comes from organizational change management literature. We created this about 8 years ago, and it's the notion of where is CSU San Marcos? Are you in a first order stage? Are you merely declaring your commitment to diversity and stopping there? Though important, we don't want to see that for a protracted period of time. Or are you in a second order stage, which is you've done the first order, you've declared, you have mission statements, policies, and directives, but now you're actually moving into actions that demonstrate that commitment. Have you moved to third and fourth order? Are you sustaining those activities? Are you linking that to a strategic goal or a vision? Is it changing the culture? Are you seeing an infusion of diversity engagement? Is it making impact in the way you want? Here's where we see you. We see that 88% of your efforts are second order. So you're definitely in an action stage. You're moving. You're beyond just stating your intention. However, I will say this. While you're in the action stage, my team and I couldn't gain traction on what you're moving towards. What is your diversity end goal? What is the larger strategy here? We recommend that you take a very concerted effort from this point on making a diversity strategic vision. Now, I read the 2012 document from your inaugural Chief Diversity Officer, and it was important because that was creating the infrastructure. That was setting into place the notion of connectivity. How do we work together? But it's not a document or a foundation that you're going to be able to rely on for the future strategic vision. That you need to create together. And if you're not all working on the same page or finding a way to come together on elements, especially given the qualitative theme that we're seeing about hostilities, you're gonna come to a fork in the road, and that fork in the road is right now. Okay? Student affairs and academic affairs are predominantly driving the second order action. So you see in the second order, you see in the first order that these four divisions are predominantly creating the mission statements, the directives, the intentional declarations. But the second order is important too in terms of the action stage. 97% of your efforts are program driven, which means that your individual programs and departments are initiating those efforts and likely funding those efforts. If diversity and inclusion and inclusive excellence are important to California State University San Marcos, then why isn't this a larger strategic initiative that's actually resourced off the top? So what we like to see is a structure where we see a university-wide alignment, a university-wide kind of resource allocation, because if not, your units are pretty much depleting their own operating budgets and exhausting their energies on diversity and inclusion when a more strategic alignment is much more sustainable. Keep in mind, we see this at a lot of campuses, and they're tired. It's the same units, it's the same people depleting their energies and their resources, and the institution gets the credit for that, right? But where's the strategic alignment? Is this a sustainable structure? Because people leave, and momentum then goes out the window. Super champions get tired, and then the momentum goes out the window. So it's something I am going to be very specific with you about in February. 89% of your efforts are geared towards active diversity and inclusion. Now, active diversity has to do with perspective taking, cultural sharing, connecting cultural issues to one another. You have that in a great deal of your efforts. And then we look at how much of your efforts is towards social justice issues. How much of it is really based on compositional concerns of demographic diversity? What about inclusion and access and historically underrepresented groups? So while you have 9% there, we only found evidence of efforts that were about 2% in overall proportionally in terms of the larger number of your efforts. Social justice, 2%. And did you know that? What do you think about that? Is social justice important to diversity and inclusion on your campus? Because you can have a diversity goal or a diversity vision that has nothing to do with justice and maybe has just something to do with intercultural competence, which for me is a very different feel. So again, it's about these decisions. You're intrinsically motivated and proactive about your efforts. So we look to see if compliance takes up the majority of the portrait, if you're responding to a series of lawsuits about diversity and inclusion, which does create the framing of diversity. And while we didn't see in a more recent crisis or reactivity, we saw compliance and protections that are important, but it didn't overshadow what you're trying to do there. So you'll see, here's where you are. You're primarily focused in your efforts. You're in an action stage. You're looking at active diversity and inclusion, and you're intrinsically motivated. But our question is, what are you moving towards? What's the larger diversity vision and end goal? You have more events than you do have strategic initiatives on diversity, which is not uncommon for all the campuses that we see, right? You have 238 events in pure raw number than any other strategic initiative. And we try to balance that out. Is it really let 1,000 flowers bloom at CSU San Marcos, which I like, but does it get away then from the strategic honed in vision of what you want to do? Maybe you want to focus on recruitment issues. Maybe it's retention and graduation issues for these specific groups. Maybe it's a little bit of events, but then maybe we're going to focus more on the trainings and the workshops. It's about making those decisions within a period of time. Most of your efforts focus on kind of this vague, overall, non-specific notion of culture and diversity. That may be used as a kind of a way to include everybody, so it's like an appeal to include everybody. I wonder if that dilutes what you really mean about diversity. Race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender are then represented next, but we've got a little smatterings of here and there. And we use the word intersectionalities to get at 4 dimensions of diversity connected together. So gender, race, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic class would be an example. And it allows us to code it. And we can tell you further what the intersectionalities were and from division to division. But, you know, for me, I was also struck by the active duty and veterans, that only 1% of your efforts were really for that population. And maybe it's because you were waiting for your center, which I believe is now up, to then create that momentum. But you're going to need to increase that, or you're going to need to put energy in that. Your efforts seem to focus predominantly on all campus members as a mass or all students. So the green and the blue that you see there the blue represents all campus members. And so this shows what efforts are focused on which population. The blue is for all campus members, the green is for all students. Now employees, which is yellow, includes faculty and staff, meaning they're appealed to as employees. The red is faculty. There was actually very little or zero for staff if it didn't also include faculty. So my question becomes, what are you doing for your faculty and your staff members, and especially your staff members, on differentiated diversity efforts? So strategic framework is important with a vision, goals, aspirations, objectives, and results. We have ideas for that in the recommendations. Your current efforts need to be more differentiated for faculty, staff, and employees because those are not fully reached. I will say, and I think graduate faculty will appreciate this, we do go from campus to campus and see if they have graduate student differentiated efforts. Honestly, in the nation, the focus on diversity seems to be predominantly on undergrad students. Unless you're in a medical school or unless you're at a campus where it's completely graduate student driven. You didn't have very much on graduate student differentiated efforts if it wasn't already included for undergraduate students. So it's an idea that we have that there should be efforts because they have different needs than your undergraduate students. Most of your efforts focus on the mainstream. So we look at how is it appealed to? Is it the mainstream of everybody? Is it for racially and ethnically specific students or for certain gendered students? And we do use this to base your retention and graduation efforts and initiatives. I was surprised that even though you have differentiated efforts, 34% of them on race, ethnicity, gender, disabilities, most of those are on the student affairs side in clubs and organizations or in some of the academic units who have really interesting graduate student associations and clubs. But you have a smaller number of racially and ethnic specific retention and graduation initiatives, and less so than I would have expected for an institution of your size and in our system. So there's something to be looked at there. So are you realizing your inclusive excellence potential? I think that there's much more to do, of course, and I will tell you more specific when I see you in February. I think one of your biggest leverage points is your curricula that then can be connected to the co-curricular side of student affairs. And I know Dulcie has a really, really interesting document, which I've read thoroughly, and I have added on kind of things I'm seeing and recommendations if you want to use those, so I can talk to you all at a later point in time. 650 of your undergraduate is already diversity related, 650 of those courses, and 174 graduate diversity related courses. If you just look at your undergrad, that's 20% of your undergraduate curricula, and we don't look at the usual suspects. We look at every course, every 100 level, 200, 300, 400 level course, every department, every discipline, because we like to see if there's an integration of it. You have 650 diversity-related undergraduate courses. And the majority of them are primary, meaning 50% or more is focused on an aspect of diversity, whether it's language, whether it's nationality, whether it's race or ethnicity. We code multiple columns of the kind of diversity that's being addressed in a course. So just so that you know that. 15% are 49% or less of the course. So that could be 1 week. That could be, 5 weeks. That could be on this one aspect of diversity for 1 week. We're able to tell you that by our layers. Most of your diversity-related courses are at the 300 and the 400 level. So then my question becomes, what's happening at the introductory levels in your undergrad? Does CSU San Marcos have a life staging plan for diversity engagement? What do you want your first years to know? Whether they're transfer students or whether they're students that come in as first-year students in terms of right out of the high school. How does that transition to the 200 level and then the 300 and the 400 level? What is your succession plan of diversity learning for your graduate students? The 500 level, the 600 level, the 700 level. Have you had conversations about that? And we have a recommendation for that. So you see 370 at the 300 and 183 at the 400. Most of your diversity-related courses in the undergraduate focus on international and global. And so we're going to ask you all about what about the other multiple dimensions? What about in terms of connecting international and global with history and power? And while we saw elements and instances of that, it wasn't over the large majority of your international and global focused courses. In terms of our diversity engagement taxonomy that we call Delta, which we modeled after Bloom's taxonomy and we created 6 years ago, the majority of it's on advanced analysis, which is perspective taking, self, other reflection, looking at culturals in comparison to each other. Level 5 is evaluation critique, which is one of our higher levels, and it's about getting at issues of power, inequalities, historical dynamics, systemic issues, systemic oppressions, and whatnot. We saw only 25% focused on that, and so it's something we wanted to ask you about it. All colleges have diversity-related courses. This makes more sense in terms of the disciplines. So of course, CHABS has more in 567, but we did see elements in science and mathematics. We did see elements in other aspects as well. Most of your diversity-related courses, again, are international focused. And in terms of what's been offered, 60% of the diversity courses in your undergrad have been offered in the last 3 years. So 40% are not offered regularly, and in fact, of the courses that are offered the most, because there's more of them and they're spread over more disciplines, international-based courses are offered more. So here's what I say about that when I go to campuses. Because international and global is a dynamic and a context that does inform many of our theories and many of our disciplinary kind of foci, you're going to get a wider range of exposure because that hits multiple kinds of disciplines, which will then hit more of your colleges and more of your classes. So institutions need to make a more concerted effort to make sure that they're also giving enough airplay time to domestic and historical issues of diversity, and in a way where there's a consistent quality of that. So you're going to hear me say that a lot in my interactions with you from this point on, now that the analysis is conducted. 13% of your diversity-related undergraduate and graduate courses have been offered every semester in the last 6 years. So, I'm sorry, in the last 3 years. And that is undergrad and graduate over the last 6 semesters. Students are exposed more to international and based diversity courses because there's so many. The majority of the race, ethnicity, and intersectionality courses are offered only once in the last 6 semesters. So either it wasn't offered at all, or it was offered only once, or then we saw a different set of courses that were offered all the time. I mean, it was a very striking pattern. In your graduate curricula, that's 29% that were diversity related, so 174 courses. All colleges have diversity-related courses in terms of number, which is good news. Of course, more in College of Education, Health and Human Services and College of Humanities, Arts, Behavioral, and Social Sciences. And these courses predominantly focus on diversity generally or in terms of a demographic or a skill set or a professional pathway. And then, which I really like the next finding, 20% do focus on them in intersectionalities. So it's looking at them in complexity, like race, gender, socioeconomic class status, and education level. And it's looking at those intersectionalities. So your graduate curricula may have some interesting integrative ways that your undergraduate curricula is not taking advantage of. Maybe one can form the other. In terms of the numbers of students or the number of exposures your campus has had on diversity In the last 3 years in undergrad and graduate, our algorithm told us it's 170,533 diversity exposures, which is the number of sections times the number of seats, that's butts and seats, sorry to be vulgar, in terms of the diversity-related coded courses in your undergraduate and graduate. 102 of your faculty respondents on our diversity pedagogy instrument said they wanted more training on diversity in the classroom, on microaggressions, difficult topics and how to facilitate that, especially about power and racism, and more critiques of disciplines and how disciplines approach diversity. And some faculty on the DPI said, I'd like to know critiques from my own discipline about how we're approaching diversity and what we're not doing. And I think it'd be a really important inter-scholar, interdepartmental, interdisciplinary kind of forum that we could do. 70 of your faculty respondents on that instrument said they received the right amount of training for diversity in the classroom, while 55 or 44% said it was too little. Okay, I think there is absolutely an opportunity and a gap on a diversity general education area. Now, I know you have a general education diversity requirement or a question that current GE diversity courses have to highlight in terms of this is how diversity is being embedded in this course, right? And we have something like that at my home institution, San Jose State. I just don't think it's enough to guarantee a high-level quality exposure. The only campuses in the nation that do not have a general education diversity requirement, and there are not many, or a standalone general education diversity area. And keep in mind, many institutions have an international-based diversity standalone area and a domestic-based standalone diversity area. The institutions that do not have that is because their curricula, undergrad and grad, or undergrad actually, are already equally, fully, and evenly integrated with diversity exposure across their curriculum. I do not see that to be the case in your undergraduate curricula. I do not see that to be the case in your general education current curricula as I see it now. And this is one of my research areas, and I also am in charge of general education diversity curricula in my department on upper division kind of intercultural kind of diversity areas. I just think there's insufficient diversity exposure in terms of what I'm seeing in your current GE. So you have 68% of our diversity-related undergraduate courses, but in terms of them being diversity-related in GE, it's about 32%, okay? And I identified ideal GE diversity requirement courses. 30% of them are already in your current GE and not necessarily in your diversity, not even necessarily given credit as like a diversity-related course. But there's 70% of the courses that I highlighted that could be a diversity GE requirement or make an area that are not. I just think that when you have a question on every course that how is diversity being approached, it's the first thing that gets kind of diluted down. It's the first thing that gets broadly addressed, but not in a meaningful way. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is my take on it. And for me, it needs to be more than that. So this is a gap. We have information for your campus on what all the other CSUs in the system do in terms of a GE diversity area or a requirement. You and San Diego State do not have a formal general education diversity requirement. And given your region and the kinds of ideological perspectives that circulate in your community, I think it's important. And I think it's important in your undergraduate. What I like about a GE diversity requirement or area is that there's a correlation, I think. Those courses are offered more because there's an FTS demand and there's a requirement of it. It guarantees a quality exposure to it for all students in terms of consistent quality. It adheres to specific criteria, and it has to have a rigorous review and recertification process. So I have much more to say about that. That's just a highlight. I encourage you, I hope I get to see you in February 2015 and share all of the findings, and you can pick my brain and my team's brain about what we think and what we found. We cannot make these decisions for you, but we want to give you as much information and how we came to that information as possible. So we were going to share with you the data narrative of all your mapping findings, efforts, undergraduate and graduate curricula, what we think the recommendations are and the next steps, connections to resources, and any questions that you have and any other key insights that we're finding. We literally can drill down at every level, at any department, and we often maintain contact with every campus for probably the next year after so that they can utilize the info that we have for them. I thank you so much for your time.